Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Brandy Espinola and I'm at the Environmental Finance Center Network. I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion, Accelerating Investment in Source Water Protection. This virtual panel is the third webinar in a series for the Source Water Collaborative's new Learning Exchange. I want to go ahead and start off by thanking you all for joining us. We have over 100 people joining us from various organizations and backgrounds today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Source Water Collaborative, it's a group of 26 organizations dedicated to helping leaders integrate source water protection into their decision-making process. These organizations are working collaboratively as well as individually with their constituents to help policymakers, planners, agricultural interests, developers, citizen groups, and other integrated source water protection experts into integrating source water protection into their key decisions, especially decisions concerning land use. In celebration of the Collaborative's 10-year anniversary, we have launched this new Learning Exchange. The Learning Exchange aims to strengthen the effectiveness of source water practitioners across the country. It is a platform to share experiences, transfer knowledge, and learn about funding and technical resources available to support our collective and individual efforts. Next slide. Over the next 5 months, between up until December 2016, we'll be learning. The Learning Exchange will offer organized events, communications, and resources by theme. In today's webinar, we have 3 expert source water protection leaders who will discuss their experiences with non-traditional partners and share tips on how to take advantage of potential watershed protection opportunities, how to establish and grow successful watershed investment programs, and how to secure dedicated funding. Our first speaker today will be Peter Stengel. Peter is the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. Peter is helping the endowment investigate ways to help mainstream water as an economic, environmental, and cultural asset for water management. Peter manages the Healthy Watershed Consortium grant program, which seeks to accelerate watershed protection across the U.S. Next, we'll hear from Todd Gartner, Senior Associate of the World Resources Institute's Food, Forest, and Water Program. He runs WRI's Natural Infrastructure for Water program, where he works with governments and businesses to invest in conserving and restoring natural ecosystems in order to secure freshwater supplies, reduce flood risks, and obtain other economic and social benefits. Today, Todd will discuss WRI's new report, Protecting Drinking Water at the Source, Lessons from the United States Watershed Investment Program. And last but not least, we will hear from Bob Morgan. Bob is the Manager of Environmental Quality at Beaver Water District, where he implements the Source Water Protection Program. Bob will discuss and answer questions about Beaver Water District Stormwater Protection Program and the events leading to establishing Source Water Protection Fund. Before we start, I have a few maintenance items to go over. We will welcome all your questions today. Please make sure to type your questions into the question box, not to be confused with a chat box. So again, all questions should be typed into the question box. Our panel will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I will share your questions with them at the end and hopefully have a very fruitful discussion. Also, we want to encourage you to visit the Stormwater Collaborative's Learning Exchange webpage to find more tools and testimonials to help you get started finding the right partners and funding options. The Learning Exchange resources and events are available to all interested groups, and you're encouraged to participate and contribute in ways that suit you and your organization's interests. Here you can see for this month's theme of funding source water protection, the Stormwater Collaborative has posted a variety of resources from its members and other organizations on its webpage. We've developed sample tweets for sharing information through social media, developed a document on key funding resources, and we have featured case studies where multiple funding sources were leveraged to finance source water protection initiatives. So with that, let us get started with Peter Stengel.
Great. Thank you, Brandy. It's a real treat to be here. I've been an admirer of the Source Water Collaborative for a long time. You all have been such a terrific positive force for watershed protection and have provided such good information to partners. It's great to be part of the program. And a particularly big thrill for me to be here with two giants of watershed protection like Todd and Bob. In fact, when I was contacted to be part of this program and learned that they would be on as well, I felt a little bit like the little kid on the playground who was shooting hoops, and all of a sudden LeBron James and Stephon Curry come by and want to play a game of horse. So a real treat for me. And when I found out that I was going to be first of the three, I wanted to reach out to Todd and Bob and make sure that I was going to set the tone for the program properly. So I asked them, what tone I should take. Should I be reflective or forward-thinking or provocative? And they responded in unison that the best thing I could do would be to be brief. So I will stick with that today. So next slide, please. I suspect that many of you are not familiar with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, so let me just give you a little background that's relevant for today's presentation. We manage a $200 million perpetual endowment, which is a lot of money, and we use the earnings from that to fund our programs. We are the working forest people, so we believe that the more uses that a forest has, the more valuable it will be to people and to society. We have three main focus areas, and those are forest health, revitalizing forest-rich communities, and developing new markets for forest products, and that includes everything from wood as a renewable, sustainable building material to ecosystem services. One of the things that I enjoy most about the endowment is that we're out to create systemic, transformative, and sustainable change. So we're not into the 1,000 acts of kindness approach to grant giving. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not us. We really look to make focused, longer-term investments, and everything we do is through partnerships. Next. We're interested in water for a couple really important reasons. We understand that about 2/3 of the fresh water in the U.S. flows through forests and forested watersheds. And it's pretty well established that a well-managed watershed produces cleaner water. If your watershed is protected, that reduces risks to the water supply. It can also reduce treatment and storage costs, so that can be very important for water consumers. And of course, a healthy watershed has a lot of other cultural and environmental benefits, everything from recreation to wildlife and carbon storage. And we're also very interested in water because we think it provides an incentive for particularly private landowners to take better care of their properties and manage them for broader societal benefits. Next. There are a lot of other groups involved in water, and when we started to take an interest 7 or 8 years ago, one of the first key questions for us was what role can we play, where can we add some value? And we invited in a group of experts to help us and identified 5 key areas, and we've stuck with these pretty faithfully over the past 7 or 8 years. They include a very systematic outreach to the water community. How do we better understand what water utilities and water administrators need, and how can we help them understand the benefits that watershed protection can play? Obviously, everybody was interested in new sources of funding. They asked us to try and better develop and understand the economic benefits of watershed protection, particularly to water utilities and water consumers. There's a lot of interest in funding pilot projects to demonstrate that watershed protection was a good move. And they also highlighted the importance of peer-to-peer communication within the water community. So elected officials talking to other elected officials about the benefits of watershed protection were much more effective than having outside environmental groups come in. Next. So today I want to focus on the funding end of things and just want to make sure everybody understands that this is very much from our perspective. There are lots of other funders out there who have different approaches that are equally good, if not better. So today you're just going to hear about ours. And I also want to highlight the fact that because of our small size and the fact that we have a relatively limited amount of funding to devote to watersheds each year, really just a few $1 million, we really look for projects that will have broader good for the water community. So kind of the rising tide floats all boats approach. How do we invest in programs that will generate even bigger sources of funding that will help a large number of partners? And also please understand that our strategy and approach with watershed protection is very dynamic. We have identified goals and we head down a path toward those goals, but don't hesitate to change course if we need to. And if we hit a dead end, we'll just recalibrate and start over and look for a better path. I'll touch on 5 different approaches today. Next. First one, and I suspect this is something you're all very familiar with, are the state revolving funds. These are low interest or subsidized loans that the states provide primarily to communities and treatment facilities for loans to upgrade their infrastructure. It's a massive, highly successful program. The interesting thing is that non-point source projects like watershed protection are eligible for funding under most state revolving fund loan programs, but about 96% of the funding so far has gone to traditional infrastructure. And a lot of folks highlighted for us that these revolving funds were an important source of funding for watershed protection. And so we've given a couple awards to the Trust for Public Land to better understand how these revolving fund loans work and how they can be better used for watershed protection. Just to quickly summarize their results, they found that in many cases the revolving funds were available and could be a great source of funding, but that it was often challenging to get to those funds. The system is set up pretty much to benefit infrastructure loans, and it takes some special expertise to get to the funding. And of course, the other challenge is that they're loans and have to be repaid. And oftentimes, watershed projects don't have an identified source of revenue that can be used to repay the loan. Nonetheless, they did find that in several cases, larger groups in particular, like the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, Conservation Fund, have been able to tap into these loans for large amounts of money. They were able to repay them through, for example, revenue from sustainable timber harvest or sale of carbon credits, something like that. And so in the right situation, in limited situations, they can be really powerful. Next slide. While we were investigating the revolving funds, we came across another approach that we thought was really interesting, called the sponsorship program. This has been pioneered in Ohio and has now been picked up in some other states. One of the really great parts of this program is that it links traditional infrastructure with watershed projects and kind of bundles them together. It's still a loan program, but basically the sponsor of a loan program agrees to do a watershed project at the same time they're doing a traditional infrastructure project, and they're rewarded in a way for that by getting a lower interest rate. Let's say, for example, your local sewage treatment plant needs $1 million to upgrade their facility. They typically go to the state revolving fund for $1 million loan, and they might get that loan at a 2% interest rate. Well, let's also say that that sewage treatment facility realizes that they've got some problems upstream with a lot of erosion, and they want to do some riparian restoration to reduce the amount of sediment coming into the stream, and that restoration costs $100,000. What they can do through a sponsorship program is bundle together their traditional $1 million request for infrastructure with the $100,000 request for the riparian restoration. And if they take that to the sponsorship program, what they'll do is get a slightly reduced interest rate. Instead of 2%, perhaps 1.8%. That lowers the payments and basically covers the cost of the watershed project. It's basically done without the need for the entity implementing the project to repay the loan. So we think it's a really clever, effective way to work. Ohio has been very successful. They've funded in excess of $160 million worth of projects. And our goal is to take this program to other states and see if we can get other entities to do it, because that would create a tremendous new source of revenue for watershed projects. Next slide. We've also been involved with conservation ballot measures. I suspect you're familiar with these. This is where a community or a county or a municipality or even a state decides to tax themselves or create some sort of a local financing structure that allows them to purchase or restore land. It's typically for parks or recreation or open space. Certainly can be used for watershed protection. Trust for Public Land and Nature Conservancy have been leaders. Trust for Public Land's website points out the great success they've had, about 81% success, and that's red and blue states. Some of the reddest states out there have some of the best programs. And TPL alone has been able to document about $59 billion in new funding. Not all of that for watersheds, but a significant portion of it for water. And oftentimes concerns about water supply are a big motivator for local communities. And so we've been able to give some grants to both the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land to expand those programs to other areas. One of the challenges with these ballot measures is you just can't go out and do it anywhere you want to. There's a lot of polling and research that takes place to make sure that the community is supportive and that there's an adequate use for the funds. But despite the fact that you can't do it everywhere, it's a big source of funding and can really pay off if you're in one of the right sites. Next slide. We've also spent a lot of time working with water utilities. Obviously, water utilities are key players in watershed programs. I think historically, a lot of water utilities didn't really focus on their water until it got to their reservoir or their pipes. But over time, as the environment has changed, as our climate is changing, many utilities have come to realize that it's very important for them to take an interest, an invested interest, in what's going on in their watershed. In a few minutes, Todd will talk a little bit about Denver and how their awareness was raised about the importance of what's going on in their watershed. And so we focused on reaching out to water utilities, helping them understand the benefits of getting involved in their watershed, how they can share costs for watershed protection programs. One of the gold standards is in Raleigh, North Carolina for the Upper Neuse River watershed. Several years ago, they created a watershed protection fee of about 10 cents per 100 gallons. Last year, they increased it to 15 cents. This comes out to basically just 50 or 60 cents a month for the average consumer, but generates more than $2 million annually for watershed projects. There's a consortium of land trusts and others that actually do the implementation. The Upper Neuse has a very sophisticated conservation plan, and these investments are designed to help keep the water clear and keep it flowing. Not everybody does it with a fee. We're working with a group of utilities here in the South that is very interested in watershed protection, but raising their fees for this was anathema, and they said, look, we'll come up with the money elsewhere, we'll take it out of our base budgets, but the goal is still the same. And at the end of today's presentation, you'll hear from Bob, and he'll talk about some of the great work that the Beaver Watershed District has done creating their own fund. Next slide. We finally wanted to highlight the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant program, which is a brand new effort. It was conceived by the EPA and now includes the Endowment and Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, as funding partners. It's a 6-year program. We're in our 2nd year. We have a very modest amount of funding available, about $2 million a year, but we're trying to grow that. And if you're interested, please check the web page for the program. We'd really enjoy talking with you. I want to stop for a second and just give accolades to EPA for conceiving of this program and for putting some money on the table to get it started, and also for NRCS for putting some money on the table. We're a private foundation, and oftentimes if a federal agency or another funding partner will step forward and put money down, we're able to match that and do great things with it. So hats off to these two agencies, and would strongly urge you next time you see someone from EPA or NRCS to stop and thank them and give them a big hug for the good work they're doing. Next. So just some particulars on this program. Last year was the 1st year of the program. We could have the next slide, please. We were overwhelmed, had no idea that we would receive this many responses. In fact, a week before the deadline last year, we hadn't received any, and I was sweating bullets that we weren't going to have any proposals to show EPA. But everybody came through, got to talk to a lot of people, some fantastic projects out there, really inspirational to see all the different programs that were underway. Next. We ended up funding 9 projects, 8 to nonprofits, 1 to a local government consortium. The local government consortium is kind of interesting. It's up in Puget Sound. It's a group of about 7 municipalities that work together on transportation issues. And they made a pretty compelling case that they thought that they could do some important planning for open space and watershed protection and bring those local municipalities along with them. And so we're going to give that a try. About $1.5 million awarded, projects in 7 states, and some pretty gaudy results when you think think about the fact that it's only a $1.4 million total award. A lot of acreage to be protected, all of these in critical watersheds. And I'll just conclude here by highlighting a couple of these projects. Next slide, please. One interesting example is down on the Gulf Coast of Florida. This is in the Sarasota region, still largely rural and agricultural, but growing very quickly. And there's a lot of interest down there in protecting some of the agricultural nature of the area and protecting the watersheds. Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast is a very small organization, just a handful of employees. And they basically came to us and said, look, we've got a half a dozen ranchers with a lot of land who want to put easements on their land to protect it for their children and grandchildren and to protect the rural nature of the property. But we as a land trust don't have time to go out and work with them and undertake all the complicated negotiations that need to be done, because we're spending all our time trying to keep the $15 memberships coming in to keep our lights on. And if you, the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant program, would help us with some of our operating expenses, we could then focus on going out and getting these ranchers involved and getting easements on their property. And so that's exactly what we did. We're providing 3 years of support that allows the staff from the Gulf Coast Conservation Foundation to go out, and we should result in anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 acres of prime watershed lands protected. Next. Another example from Colorado, the Fort Collins area, the Colorado Conservation Exchange. They're interested in creating a watershed investment fund. You may be familiar with these from some of the work that the Nature Conservancy and others have done. In this case, the Colorado Conservation Exchange isn't interested in buying and protecting property through easements, but instead looking to improve stewardship of land that's already in public ownership. The forests out there are not receiving the management they need. They're overstocked. Trees are dying as a result of beetle infestations and climate change. The forests are highly vulnerable to catastrophic wildfires, which then puts the watershed at risk. The challenge is there's a lot of land that needs to be treated with forest thinning. It's a very expensive project. And so what we're hoping to do is support the exchange to go out and try and engage local businesses to get them to contribute to a fund that would be used to accelerate these treatment programs. So they're targeting groups like businesses that depend on water, like a brewery, or even local chamber of commerce that realizes that having a healthy, reliable supply of water is critical for continued economic growth. Next. And then finally, just to give you kind of the moonshot approach, Pacific Forest Trust is taking on some of California's very large water needs. You know, they're just coming off a long-standing drought, still drought conditions in many places. It's a big issue out there. About 7 million acres in this particular watershed where the Pacific Forest Trust is working need to be protected and restored. They have an estimated price tag to do this of about $4.25 billion. This is a huge project. Pacific Forest Trust and their partners are undertaking a number of different projects, including loans from the State Revolving Fund, beneficiary pays programs, as well as some policy initiatives. In fact, they had a great success just a couple weeks ago when the governor signed some legislation that put protection funding on par with funding for traditional infrastructure like dams. And they think that this is really going to open the door for some public financing for watershed protection that could be a great model for the entire country. And again, a relatively modest award from our end, $225,000 over 3 years, but gives Pacific Forest Trust some of the fuel they need to go out and try and do some of these impressive projects to protect California's watersheds. Next. We depend on feedback from folks like you who are listening today to help us grow our programs and identify new ideas. And again, just want to thank the Source Water Collaborative folks for the opportunity to be here, and hope that we have the chance to talk to some of you listening to hear your ideas about what's going on. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. This is Todd Gartner from the World Resources Institute, and Peter was quite humble in his opening remarks as he gave praise to Bob and I and folks at the Source Water Collaborative. But the endowment has been a key player over the last decade in driving this space forward, both through their financial support of pilots and things like the Healthy Watershed Consortium, but also really focused on bringing folks together and making sure that all of the different sectors are thinking about source water protection in a more holistic way, which is really what I would like to focus on today. How do we pull together all of the key pieces to make natural infrastructure the new norm? Next slide, please. So WRI, many of you may be familiar, is a global environmental think tank that works across the globe. My area of focus really spans two of our core resource areas: forest and landscape restoration and water. And when we refer to our natural infrastructure for water program, we're really focused on how we can drive large-scale investment into our watersheds to provide flood control, water quality enhancements, and drought mitigation, all while thinking about communities that are living within those forested areas and economic development for urban and city dwellers. Without thinking about both the environmental and social and economic uplifts, we don't think this is going to be a scaled opportunity. Next slide, please. And so over the last 60 years, probably even longer, we've gotten really good as a society at trying to build our way out of these water issues. More storage reservoirs, better dikes and dams, more efficient piping, and the like. But the issues are really changing, and we need to better understand what is happening within our landscapes. Next slide. And the idea of natural infrastructure, taking a more holistic approach, is not new. We all know the Catskills example. Many communities in the New England area bought or gained control of their watersheds a generation ago. Portland, Oregon, Seattle similarly have total control of their watersheds, and not surprisingly, those are the areas that have some of the cleanest drinking water available. Next slide. And when folks think about the benefits of green and gray, and this is a big and intentional point that I'd like to make. Even a number of years ago, I was very much referring to this as green or gray. But when we think about accessing financing, when we think about broadening our approach to bring in different sectors, it needs to be that hybridized, optimized approach that looks at when and where the green elements are compatible and can leverage the already built gray infrastructure pieces. And we think about the potential cost savings. Again, New York City, $9 billion versus $2 billion, but we are starting to see literally dozens of other economic analyses showing that those cost savings, both in the upfront capital costs and in the long-term operation and maintenance space, can dramatically be reduced. Next slide. Part of that is because of the impacts of climate change. When you think about investing in the watershed, people often think about it as a soft path. As we learn more about how there's going to be changes in the climate, how fires and insects and those sorts of things are going to impact water delivery, taking a soft approach allows us to adaptively manage on the fly, whereas if we strictly invest in gray infrastructure, we're stuck with that footprint for the next 30 years. Next slide. And again, it's not just the environment, it is people too. They're the ones that are voting on ballot measures. They're the ones who are going to decide if a rate surcharge is appropriate. So these approaches need to work for those living and working in our rural forested areas, but also for those in the city. Next slide. And so what we've tried to do at WRI is answer one of the key questions. How do we move from the fact that most people think this makes a lot of sense to the reality that we've only seen a handful of really successful examples? And when we began to talk to practitioners, utilities, government officials, we kept getting the same questions. How do we start this? What are the key design elements, and how do we finance at scale? So in collaboration with Peter's group at the U.S. Endowment, some funding from NRCS and our colleagues at Colorado State, and we actually have one of our co-authors, Heidi Huber-Stearns, on the line as well. I'd like to thank her for her contributions. We put together a publication which was just launched on Thursday, kind of taking a retrospective look at what has been successful in the past and how can we apply those lessons for watershed programs moving forward. Next slide. And we did that by bringing together some of the smartest minds in the game, many of whom are on the line today. Those that are involved in watershed protection programs from across the country, engaging at different points of a program and having different roles in the process. And you can see some of those folks and the roles that they might play. And through them, we really dialed in on what would be most important to articulate to others trying to drive these types of programs in their own watershed. Next slide, please. And so we ended up picking 13 different watershed investment programs across the U.S., and we were intentionally diversified in terms of public and private land ownership, where they sit, the types of issues that are impacting them from fire and flood and land use change, and really drive in to understand, what would it take, what did they do, and how can we apply that to other places. Next slide, please. And so for each of those 13 programs, in aggregate, we interviewed about 70 different professionals who were involved at the land trust side, working with the Forest Service, utilities, private corporations, academic institutions, nonprofit agencies who were serving as intermediaries, and really dialing in on how did you get this started? How did you really build momentum and get the right people in the room and identify a clear vision of success? How did you design the program from determining what you were trying to monitor, how you understood what success looked like, what that economic analysis to provide a return on investment might entail, and then ultimately, how do you build from the pilot level to a meaningful level of scale, and how do you then broaden the number of stakeholders that are part of the process. Next slide, please. So when you start, it really focuses on messaging. What are you trying to do, and what issues do you need to address? What are the risks, and how do you turn those risks into an opportunity to rally support? And most of the issues that we focused on were around water quality, drought, and flooding. Next slide, please. But understanding what is driving those risks is key to a successful watershed investment program. And how do you then design it in a way to mitigate those risks for the long term? Next slide, please. Everyone has a very general idea of what's going on in their watershed and what those risks might be. But how do you really take advantage of a window of opportunity? A catastrophic wildfire, a major flood, taking these really negative events and finding the silver lining to galvanize support to do something in a meaningful way. Next slide. Next slide, please. And as a key example there was the Denver Water Force to Faucet program, which Peter mentioned. A terrible fire in the late 2000s drove over $26 million of remediation that primarily was funded by the water utility. When they looked at their landscape and saw that it was only a matter of when, not if, that the next major wildfire would occur, they started to get creative. Conversations started to happen with non-traditional partners in the Forest Service, with some of the nonprofits in the area, academic institutions, and they came up with this incredible program to each invest $16.5 million, both the Forest Service and the water utility, to restore the watershed at a meaningful scale. So taking a catastrophic event, seeing it as a window of opportunity to drive forward a program. Next slide, please. And to do that, you got to understand the roles that need to be played and when it's important for each of those entities to come into the fold. And what we saw 5-10 years ago was institutions, primarily nonprofits, trying to do everything. They were trying to do the stakeholder engagement, the economic analysis, the prioritization of the landscape, the financing, the messaging, communication, and that's not feasible. So what we really tried to do in the report is understand what are those key roles on the supply side, the demand side, and on the coordination side. Next slide, please. What are the external consultations that you need to build out the business case, to do the communications and messaging, and what does that flow of money and knowledge look like? Next. And ultimately, how do you message around these pieces of evidence and information? The message is as important, if not, the messenger is as important as the message itself, and having those appropriate people in place is extremely important. Next slide, please. Next. It was remarkable how varied the vision of success was amongst the 13 programs that we looked at. But that vision is extremely important, but also should not be seen as set in stone. When we talked to folks, we understood and we learned that You set a vision, but as you broaden the number of folks around the table, you may have to modify that to make sure that as many of the different groups as possible see real value. And real value means the likelihood of potential investment and support. This is also something that we consistently heard from advocates as something to look back at every quarter or every year to monitor progress against these initial visions and how it can really serve as the foundation for the messaging campaign, whether it's via a ballot initiative or working with government entities. Next slide, please. One of the things I mentioned in the roles of the different players is the messenger. WRI has a lot of strengths, but we are probably not the right group to be talking to local stakeholders in a really in-depth way. It really is important to identify who are the champions that can drive you through the political hurdles. Who are the utility experts who can make this be seen as something more than a green group initiative. The former mayor of Raleigh, Charles Meeker, did an incredible job of taking this upon his shoulders and driving it forward. In the Denver example, Harris Sherman, the former Undersecretary of Agriculture, was the champion there who really was able to overcome some of the naysayers and say, no, this can be a new paradigm for cooperation between the government and utilities. And in Portland, Maine, Paul Hunt from the Portland Water District was one who took it upon himself to work with the board and increase investment in source water protection. Next slide. But to do that, to tie these things together, it needs to be based on sound science. You need to have a very clear understanding that you'll never have enough money to do everything that you want to do. So how do you prioritize? And how do you prioritize in such a way that considers not just ecological factors like topography and distance to the intake and road network, but also some social elements as well? How do you make sure that equity is built into this and that everyone has a say in how the prioritization process will be developed and that you can be as transparent as possible? Short-term gains are meaningless if you don't have the long-term vision consistently at the forefront. And bringing as many folks into the puzzle early on and have them try to poke holes in the plan is way more advantageous than having them do it later on. Next slide, please. What we heard arguably more than anything else is getting people to qualitatively understand that this was an important approach was relatively easy. But then turning that into an investment was really challenging. And part of that was the struggle around making a clear return on investment business case around reduced costs, avoided need for new infrastructure, reduced regulatory risks, and the cost savings in the face of climate change on the resilience side. But also really trying to quantify a lot of the co-benefits, again, which don't just focus on water, but on livelihoods and other ecosystem services as well. Next slide. And one of the kind of foundational analyses that we helped out with that really helped play this out was in Portland, Maine, where we looked at a number of different scenarios relative to their filtration avoidance waiver and recognized that a natural infrastructure approach in coordination with a built infrastructure investment could save up to 70% over a 20-year period. And it was important early on that we really try to understand how an economic analysis could ultimately fit into a financing decision. Along with a lot of advocacy and other types of analyses, this business case helped convince the board of the Portland Water District to increase their investments in easements by a 25%. So really analysis into action. Next slide, please. But knowing what you want to do, what the cost savings might be, and who needs to be around the table is just conversation if you can't figure out how to finance it. And Peter described some incredible programs that are really gaining steam, from revolving loan funds, the Healthy Watershed Consortium grant, and a number of others. So we dug really deep with those programs to understand, where did the seed funding come from? how did you move from pilot to some meaningful level of scale? What's next, and what do you need to know? And we identify and dig into many of these financing mechanisms in some level of depth. Next slide, please. But there are 3 different funding mechanisms that I would like to just quickly describe to really leverage some of the ones that Peter mentioned that I think in a couple of years are going to be incredible opportunities to bring new and leveraged money to deal with source water protection. The first is this idea of green bonds. So we already bond for our traditional built infrastructure. How do we think about broadening that approach and developing standards around it to really understand what is green, to be able to have the next 50 million bond issuance have maybe 35 for pipes, reservoirs, and cement, and 15 for source water protection, restoration, and the like. So we're working with the Climate Bonds Initiative, Ceres, Agua, and a number of others on a standard around green bonds, which will be out for public comment in January. And we hope to pilot test it with at least 2 municipalities and utilities in calendar year 2017. And I'm happy to describe a bit more about that offline for those that are interested. Next slide, please. Peter mentioned some of the issues we're having in the West with drought-stricken forests, with disease and catastrophic wildfire, and a lot of that is due to our overstocked forests. The Forest Service alone will never have the financial capacity to deal with it themselves. So how do we think about public-private partnerships and driving private capital to leverage public dollars and utility financing to really deal with this issue at the scale of the challenge we have in front of us? Next slide, please. To do that, we're working on a program called the Forest Resilience Bond. And the very short description of this is driving private capital, both debt and equity, to in an upfront way, finance the forest restoration in western forests that needs to happen. And then the payback would happen by having a multitude of payees. So instead of the Forest Service having to pay the entire freight, they would only pay 60% and pay that back over a longer period of time. Those revenue streams would likely be matched by investments or by investments from water and electric utilities and water-dependent companies. We're right now looking at experimenting with this in the Sierras and in the Front Range of Colorado, and already have a few utilities and Forest Service regions who thinks this makes a lot of sense. Everyone pays a little bit but gets a lot of benefit by tapping into public-private partnerships. Next slide, please. And on that idea of private engagement, in addition to touching the investment sector, you're also seeing an increased level of engagement with the corporate sector, especially in the food and beverage industry. Many of you are familiar with what Coca-Cola has done with USDA, but many of these other entities that you see on the screen are developing 20-year water stewardship plans where investment in source water protection is a foundational element. They're trying to understand where their investments can have leveraged opportunity to have the most impact possible, and how they can also protect their own assets. So I encourage you to think broadly about trying to first understand who is operating in your watershed downstream from where your forested area is and how best to engage them. Next slide. And just a few more here to close it out before passing it over to Bob to really dig in deeply with what they did in Arkansas. Engaging landowners, and I should expand this to really engaging landowners and land managers, because this applies especially on the East Coast to smaller non-industrial forest holdings and your industrial managers, but also public land managers. And increasingly, as USDA touts the all lands approach, we need a very clear way to figure out how to aggregate these folks. And there's a lot of lessons that we can take from the carbon markets, from forest certification, and think about how we can utilize our local capacity of land trusts and conservation districts to really get the level of acreage and landowners necessary to have a meaningful impact. It is a long game. So building those relationships is critical. Takes a long time, but the payoff is well worth it. Next slide, please. The last 2 points that I want to mention are somewhat administrative, but the devil always is in the detail. What we found is when programs tried to develop with a half FTE, more times than not, they were unsuccessful. Making that upfront investment in real staff to be dedicated to source water protection from utilities in partnership with land trusts and other conservation groups was one of the key indicators of sustained success. Having someone be able to focus on the policy side, on the communications, on the science was pretty critical. And we recognize that many utilities are not currently well designed to have those types of capacity. That's where programs like the Healthy Watersheds Consortium that Peter described come in really well. There are grant funding and public dollars available to really build out the capacity to make this a reality. Next slide, please. And the last core lesson that we heard very clearly from programs was the importance of monitoring and how most folks sort of left the monitoring and evaluation for the end. And there are 2 problems with that. One, they didn't necessarily have strong baseline data to compare their improvements against. And 2, there was a lot of questions about should we be output-based or outcome-based? Should it be acres and landowners and practices, or should it be reduction in sediment and nutrients and fire risk reduction? And I think the answer is a little bit of both. We need to be very pragmatic about what we can measure and monitor both ecologically and economically in the first couple of years of the program, but ultimately 5 and 10 years in, we need to be thinking about how we can really show a true return both ecologically and economically, and setting those systems up early is critical to be able to make sure you're collecting the right information over time. Next slide, please. And so again, these were the 10 lessons that we covered in detail. This was based on over 60 interviews for folks who've been intimately involved in these programs, and we try to lay the information out in an easily digestible way with tangible examples that we hope that you can apply to your own watersheds. Everyone thinks that their watershed is so unique and it couldn't possibly build upon efforts in other areas because of the social and political dynamics, what have you. But what we found is, upwards of 2/3 of program design and financing elements are extremely similar whether you're in Portland, Maine or Portland, Oregon. So we want you to really build upon what we've been able to capture and focus on that 25% that truly is unique to your watershed. Next slide, please. And with that, that is the web link for the publication. I'm also going to be sending around to the organizers of the Source Water Collaborative, this link as well as links to some of the blogs and podcasts that we've recently launched describing this information in more detail. So a huge thanks to the Source Water Collaborative and my colleagues Peter and Bob for participating, and look forward to the discussion after Bob's incredible presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Todd. And now we'll hear from Bob Morgan from Beaver Water District on their Source Water Protection Fund.
Well, thank you, Brandy. Like the other 2 presenters, I want to say that I was somewhat intimidated when I heard who I was presenting with, but I'm going to do what I can. What I want to do today is talk about our funding for our source water protection program at Beaver Water District. I'll get into describing how we define sustainable in a little bit, but basically want to go through the story of how we got to where we are. Next slide. Beaver Water District is a water wholesaler. We only deal with cities. We don't have retail customers. We're a moderately sized utility, but we expect that that's going to change rapidly over the next 20 to 30 years because we are one of the fastest growing areas in the country. we provide water to the metropolitan area of Northwest Arkansas. And go ahead to the next slide. Our source of water, which is what we're talking about, is Beaver Lake. Beaver is a Corps of Engineers multi-purpose reservoir. It's ample in size. In fact, it'll meet our needs in terms of quantity for at least the next 40 years and possibly beyond that if we manage to implement good conservation practices within our users. Also, there are 3 other smaller utilities that use Beaver as their source of water. One thing to note, though, as a multi-purpose reservoir, we don't really have a lot of control over what happens on the reservoir, so that complicates our source water protection program somewhat. Next slide. The quality of the water in Beaver is fair to good currently. We do have some issues. We have turbidity spikes and bacteria spikes, mostly related with large storms, which we seem to be having more and more often. But we really don't have a lot of problems other than a persistent taste and odor problem that occurs each fall and seems to be increasing problems with disinfection byproducts. Both of those probably related to algae in the watershed, and the algae, or algae in the lake, and the algae in the lake seems to be directly related to the nutrient and phosphorus loading to the lake from the watershed. Part of what drives our urgency here is that the models show that if we take no action at all, we can expect to see these problems get worse over time, and eventually would probably have to implement additional treatment at our water distribution or water treatment plant. Next slide. So looking at our watershed, it is very large, about 750,000 acres. But fortunately, it's about 60% forest, the dark green in the little map, and 30% is pasture with a little urban area currently, but the area is expanding, and we expect to see the urban region expand into our watershed over the next 10 to 15 years. We do have lots of potential sources of contamination, as you can imagine, in a 750,000 acre watershed, including 3 point sources. We also can look at our stressors in the watershed, and those are the animal waste application on the pastures, rural roads, stream erosion may be our biggest problem. Most of the people in this watershed are on individual waste systems, so septic tanks can be an issue, and the expansion of the urban development is an issue that we have to consider. So that's our situation that we're working in, and I kind of want to look at our program now, how it evolved over the last several years. So go to the next slide, please. And this is a timeline that looks at where we came from and where we are now. And this goes all the way back. The district was formed in '57, but we really only started producing water in '73. And for the first 20 years, our board was really interested in water quality, but the focus was on point sources and how to manage those 3 point sources within the watershed. That kind of didn't necessarily solve itself, but the problem was improved greatly in the late '80s when new treatment plants were put in at the wastewater systems in the cities in the watershed. So our focus then in the early '90s shifted to the non-point sources within the watershed. In '93 we started a tributary monitoring program that we hoped would help us to quantify the loads coming from the non-points and to also characterize where those loads are coming from. Through the '90s, we had kind of a hit and miss program. We worked with different groups as they wanted to do Section 319 projects or USDA projects in our watershed, but really had no strategy on what we were doing, so it was kind of muddling through at that point. 2004, the district went through a long-range strategic planning process, and that was for the treatment and everything. In that process, it became apparent that we needed a source water protection program. So the board approved that, and in 2005 we initiated our source water protection about 11 years ago. One of the first things that we did was to develop a philosophy and a policy on source water protection. You might call that a vision statement, as Todd was. Turns out, and I didn't really think so at the time, but that's probably one of the key things that we did, because we worked on that strongly with our board of directors. And because of their involvement in it and their approval of it, that kind of gave us the mandate to do what it takes to protect the source. And that's where we built our program on that. Also in 2006, we made some attempts at watershed ordinances. We found out, excuse me, the real importance of that watershed champion that Todd was talking about. We didn't have one when we went to our county quorum court, and when opposition came out of the woodwork, the quorum court disappeared on us. So we determined that ordinances probably weren't in the works for Northwest Arkansas. What that did do, on the other hand, was it caught the ear of the Northwest Arkansas Council. That's a group of businessmen who worked together to improve development in the state, in the area. They saw that water quality was an issue that could limit growth, so they commissioned the development of a watershed strategy. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. That strategy was put together with a national consultant using a stakeholder-driven process. Was published in 2009. One of the key components of that was to develop a stakeholder-driven watershed council. That was the Beaver Watershed Alliance, which is not related directly to Beaver Water District, and that was formed in 2011. We've been implementing programs since then. In 2016, just this year, we approved what we determined to be sustainable funding. Next slide, please. The strategy that was developed back in 2009 is a science-based document. We used a lot of the data we had collected from back in the 90s forward, and models that we worked with the University of Arkansas and our consultant to develop, and it ended up being a 50-year plan of action that would maintain water quality in Beaver Lake if the plan was implemented. Like I said, it was developed by the stakeholders. It included 5 key components I'll mention just a second. One of those critical ones was the creation of that council and the 10 core best management practices that we wanted to implement. We'll refer to this as the BLWPS in the future. Okay, next slide, please. So the alliance, which was organized out of this, Beaver Water District was instrumental in helping establish that alliance, but we are only one of 21 board members on the alliance, so it is truly a stakeholder group. Their mission is to maintain high quality drinking water in Beaver Lake and improve quality of water in the watershed. And another key thing, I think, is they adopted as their purpose for existing the implementation of that Beaver Lake watershed strategy. So you can see there that going through kind of Todd's list, we have a vision that we've kind of developed. We have a written document helping us know where we're going, and now we have a group that's dedicated to implementing that. Next slide. So now we're trying to look at what it's going to cost and how we're going to build a case for spending these $300 million that we have to spend over 40 years. You can see the components of the plan: the Watershed Council, the core management practices, contractor certification, education and stewardship, monitoring and adaptive management. I don't want to get into details on those, but you can see the costs, fairly significant for a relatively small utility. Roughly $6 million a year, which is, if we funded all of that, that would be 1/3 of our budget. So how are we going to pay for it? Next slide. And a lot of potential sources. Peter and Todd both talked about a lot of these. I'll just kind of hit some of them quickly. The idea of a watershed tax. Probably successful in many areas. In Arkansas right now, the word tax is a 4-letter word, but we also, it probably would be more successful if we were looking at purchasing a lot of land, which is really not in the works in our watershed, which is, by the way, 90% privately owned. We could look at the bond issue. Again, really good for purchasing land, have been used successfully in lots of places. I like Todd's idea of coupling that with some of the gray infrastructure things. But again, that's not something that's going to build a program because the way we interpret sustainability, and again, going back to what Todd said, is having a staff that is available to work regardless of what extramural funds they can bring in. So we're looking for funding that core staff with these funds. The Section 319 programs, other EPA programs, a lot of good work done with that. It's difficult to fund that sustainable staff with those funds. The USDA programs, same thing. Good money, we use it all the time, but it's difficult to get that certainty for the staff. Philanthropic organizations, we have good ones in Northwest Arkansas that have been very supportive of us, but they want to get something started and then kind of back away and watch it go. So again, it doesn't help with maintaining that staff. Donations are kind of a limited potential. Program income might be a source. If you have a lot of forest that you own, you could look at doing forestry practices to generate income. The danger there is letting the income become the focus instead of protecting water quality. Also, we don't really have that opportunity. So it really came down to, could we implement some sort of fee at the utility? And that was our option. The utility is local. It's going to be around for a long time, very dependable. I guess the downside of utility fee is that the quantity or the volume of money that you could raise is somewhat limited, but that's the way we decided to go with it. Next slide. So now building the case. What we have tried to do since we started the program is work with our board of directors to convince them that what we are doing in source water is really important to the whole process of providing potable drinking water. We want them to understand what we're doing, but we also want them to understand that what we're doing is based on a business model that we're trying to put in place. So there was lots of questions we had to answer. What's it going to cost us? Can we document benefits? How is it going to affect our customers? Is the alliance the right group? Do we really want to work with them? And how are we going to account for those funds? Next slide. So, like I said, we can't come up with $6 million actually. I guess in a disaster we probably could. But what is the cost of that sustainable funding? And I'm looking at the funding for the Beaver Watershed Alliance, and we thought they had to have staff that could work in the watershed, could seek other funds, and would be there whether those other funds come through or not. So that turned out to be about 6 people, about $500,000. We'd like for the other districts to share with us on that, so our share of that's about 78%. And you go through all that, and we needed to have approximately $700,000 annually to make our program sustainable. Divide that by the 17 billion gallons of water we treat every year, it comes out to $4 or 4 cents per 1,000 gallons. Next slide. So looking at documenting the benefits, and this process we just kind of finished, but are there economic benefits to implementing this program? We did a triple bottom line analysis of the program and just finished it, looking at the economic value to Beaver Water District, the environmental values, and the social values to the community at large, and implemented that over a 40-year period, looking at the cost of fully implementing the strategy we developed versus the cost of basically the avoided cost of not having to put in new treatment. The way that turned out is there's about $125 million of benefits over the cost overall, but if we just look at the district, there's about $18 million of benefits over our costs over the 40 years. So that indicates that we are thinking business on this case. Next slide. Do you do a meter fee or a rate structure? Either way, meters probably easier on big users because they only pay once a month. Rate structure probably shares the cost more equally. Meters are pretty transparent, meter fees, whereas rate structure may not be. But in our case, no new accounting was required, and it gave our wholesale customers some flexibility. So we went with rate structure. Next slide. And is the alliance the right group? Well, they've been working for 5 years now. They've built a history of success. They have developed the relevant stakeholders that they need to work with. They have developed a good reputation of getting things done in the watershed. So they have a 4 or 5 year history of successful programs. And they also have been very effective at leveraging the funds that they've had. So we know that they can take what we work with them on and expand that. In terms of accountability, how do we see that their money is being spent well? We are a public entity and we have to be stewards of the funds that we have. We take the approach that we are buying the service of the Beaver Watershed Alliance for implementing the Beaver Lake Watershed Protection Strategy. So that way we are buying a product. We require an annual scope of work from them, memorandum of agreement with measurable outcomes. We require them to report annually to us on how they did against those outcomes, and at any time we could change our mind and go to another group if we need to. We also sit on their board of directors, so that's a plus. Next slide. So this is what we ended up with. We dedicate 4 cents per 1,000 gallons sold to our Source Water Protection Fund. The stipulation be that those funds go towards implementing the Beaver Lake Watershed Protection Strategy by providing core funding to the Beaver Watershed Alliance and other relevant projects that the district wants to implement. We require that annual plan of work with a summary report and audit, and we coordinate with the other districts. So the board approved that. And next slide. So in summary, this is what I would say in terms of building support is start early, build a culture at your group, including your governing body that includes source water protection. Have a written strategy for protecting your source. Work with your partners, develop the partners that can make an impact, build an early history of success. Establish your goal for funding. What are you going to try to do? Stay focused on the drinking water component as a utility. Now, it may be different for different groups, but our sole purpose in life is to put out good drinking water. We have to stay focused on that, otherwise we get accused of wasting funds. And remember that you're buying a product. You're not funding an organization or a movement. You're actually buying a project. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brandy.
Thanks, Bob. Clearly you're all experts in the field and leaders in your industry, all bringing a very different perspective on this issue. I want to open it up now to attendee questions, and we can start getting a good discussion going. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the question box. So first I just wanted to talk about the fact that each of you guys in your own way sort of mentioned either building the case or the importance of outcomes and outputs and monitoring. And Peter, you mentioned sort of that your fund focuses on systemic change. But the question I wanted to ask was, how are watershed investment programs accounting for and communicating success given that intangible nature of the results, right? So we're talking more about pollution avoided rather than diminished. So how are you guys communicating success in your various programs?
This is Peter. I'll offer one small example and then turn it over to the other two. So one important way that we communicate success is through peer-to-peer communication. So early on, we actually worked with a consultant to help us better understand the water community, particularly the water utility community. And one of the key learnings from that project was that, not surprisingly, water community people like to learn from other water community people. So one thing we've tried to do is facilitate communication by people like Bob, who are in there day-to-day, fighting the day-to-day battles and responding to all the other issues they have to respond to, and get him out talking to his peers and help his peers understand how and why they made the decisions they make. So that's one area where we've been trying to help facilitate some communication is peer-to-peer within the water utility community.
If I could add, this is Bob. One thing is when you start talking about success of the program, it really is a fine line because you have to maintain some urgency and at the same time not be totally discouraging, so you have to show success, and that's really a difficult balance, and we do have a public relations department here that does a pretty good job of getting that message out to our community. One of my challenges is to work with that department to make sure what they put out is based on the science and taken down to the general public level while maintaining the right message. The other thing that we do, are maintaining the support of our board is absolutely critical, and they need to know what we're doing and how that's affecting the water. So I find myself in front of the board 3 or 4 times a year talking about different projects and programs that we're working on, and maintaining that communication I believe has really helped us get their support for advancing our program.
Yeah, and I'll just add very quickly, I think Peter and Bob both hit it pretty clearly there. It really depends who you're trying to demonstrate success or progress to. If you look at a lot of the programs in the Intermountain West and in the Rockies range, the focus is really around reducing the risks of catastrophic wildfire. And so in a lot of ways, they use some of the indicators that the Forest Service has used for decades to determine if the areas have moved from high severity risk to medium, from medium to low, which oftentimes is enough of an indicator of success to drive investment, versus what the work we did in Portland, Maine, where we really needed to demonstrate an economic return on investment that would be associated with precluding additional sediments and nutrients from hitting the system. In other places, they've simply been comfortable with measuring and monitoring the number of acres and practices engaged and are willing to pay for that. I think the most important thing is trying to lay that out early on with as broad a group as possible, see if it works or doesn't, and then modify as you go.
Excellent. So we have a few audience questions, and I'll just go ahead and start with one from Dave Moss, or Daniel Moss. And so he pointed out that we often get caught up in thinking heavily about watershed investment and restoration and not enough on establishing better land use policies and addressing polluters. So how do you see the collaborative pushing for better implementation of environmental laws? Is that something that's high on the priority in all of your different fields of work?
This is Todd. I'll take the first stab at that. I mean, I think it's a good point. And oftentimes, there's different players and capacities that you need for each. Those who have the ins in the policy realm versus those who can help develop and scale a watershed investment program. And in no way are they mutually exclusive. Part of that, I think, focuses on the window of opportunity. So looking at the political realities within your jurisdiction, and is now the time where a major policy push, where a modification of legislation is likely to occur and would be a really good use of time and resources, or does it make sense to sit on that a little bit, really work on what you can do on the ground, demonstrate success, and then try to build upon that to influence policy and guidance and the like. And then at what level? Some of the policy efforts should be focused at the very local or municipal level, others at the state or even national level. And I think if you look at the Pacific Forest Trust, which Peter mentioned as one of the grantees of the Healthy Watershed Consortium, they help lead an effort in California, which was just approved within the last month, that treats watersheds and natural infrastructure as allowing utilities to recognize that as infrastructure in the way that they do business. And it's still unclear exactly what that will mean in terms of depreciating an asset, et cetera, but it's a major push in sort of the policy realm, which will have huge implications. So I think in the end you have to focus on them both in parallel.
And this is Bob, kind of building on what Todd says. We found that our community wasn't ready for new land use ordinances, and that's just the culture of Northwest Arkansas. But on the other hand, most of the people are very willing to work one-on-one, and our incentive programs working individually have worked out well. So you have to look at the culture of who you're trying to reach, and are they the ones, are they amenable to new regulations? Like Todd said, sometimes the time is just right to step forward with regulations, and sometimes it's not. So that would be my advice, and answer is really, it depends on the community you're working in.
Randy, I have nothing to add.
Sure, okay. So then let's go on to another question. Are there examples of watershed programs that have failed? And if so, what lessons learned can be taken from those examples?
It's a great question, one that we've gotten a lot. And trying to capture lessons from programs that have failed is sometimes challenging, one, because a lot of the people aren't there anymore, and people aren't always willing to transparently talk about things that didn't work. But we did both talk to programs that maybe got some pilot funding and then were never able to reach the next level of maturity, and even folks with some of the programs that we deemed as successful who were very, very clearly able to lay out what they would do differently now, what they learned. What we thought would be most helpful in the publication was really try to frame those challenges, just like we did with the risks, into opportunities and a way forward. So this is what you should do. Here are some of the things that you need to look out for, and when in the process it makes the most sense to try to address those issues. So I think as a conservation community, whether you're a water utility, public official, or NGO, we do need to do a better job of feeling comfortable talking about what didn't work. For the purpose of this report, we really try to frame that in what can you do better moving forward.
This is Peter. I'll add a little bit to that. The endowment's first dive into watershed protection was a terrific partnership with Natural Resources Conservation Service Conservation Innovation Grant Program. And we co-funded 3 large projects on the East Coast as kind of pilots to talk about these beneficiary pays programs. Total investment of about $4 million. One of the 3 worked. That was the Raleigh example. The other 2 did not or haven't come to fruition yet. And I can't remember all the details, but just some examples of things that went wrong. One of the ones that did not succeed, there was a lot of local politics. There were some very controversial issues involving expenses associated with reservoir dredging and things like that, and basically there was a political climate that just didn't allow for that sort of proactive thinking to occur. The other one was a very, very large watershed. It touched a lot of people. It was difficult getting some of the larger population bases, some of the cities engaged or excited about protecting watersheds that were literally hundreds of miles away. There were challenges getting the corporate community involved. In some ways, it was just such a huge watershed, it was difficult for it to happen. So there are groups out there that have not succeeded yet. Those 2 that I just referred to, we've by no means given up on them, but our first dive into this, we were 1 for 3, so it happens.
And I'd say that the reason we think that sustainability means sustaining the staff is because the the watershed groups that I've watched in Arkansas, the ones that succeed are the ones that are able to find a source of funding for some element of staff other than a one-time grant, and those that try to depend on grant funding will eventually come to a time when they have to lay off most of their staff because they don't have funds to pay them. And once you lose that continuity of service within the watershed, then you're starting over from scratch. So it's real important to keep that person on the ground.
Thank you. So now I think we have a question specifically for Peter. Actually, we have two. So the first one is, do you do outreach to state revolving fund programs to promote the sponsorship program? And then also, do you know if there's a fund for treatment of priority uplands or watersheds through biophysical measures?
So the first one is yes. So we're actively reaching out to the revolving fund leadership in the states to try and help them understand how sponsorship programs might help and might contribute to their water quality needs. So yes. And Ben, tell me the second one again. I didn't quite understand that.
Sure. So there was a question about whether there was a fund for the treatment of priority uplands or watersheds through biophysical measures.
So I mean, I assume that means things like forest treatment, thinning of forests, things like that.
Yes.
And whether or not there's a specific fund to do that. I mean, there are lots of different programs that do that. I mean, NRCS, for example, they are the world leaders in funding for private landowners to do those sorts of activities. Certainly the federal agencies that have a land base provide funding for their land base. Todd or Bob, are you aware of others that focus specifically on that?
No.
Yeah, I think you described it pretty well.
Thanks, Peter. And so, Todd, this question is specifically for you. Regarding the science-based approach, what are the tools that seem to resonate best with stakeholders, and what are the indicators that define success in terms of monitoring?
That's a good question. There are a lot of prioritization tools out there that focus on sort of the ecological elements. So there's a conservation priority index, there's an optimization tool that Colorado State is developing, many of which look at the raw acreage and then look at topography, soil erodibility, proximity of the parcel relative to an intake point, to the river system, etc. And they can weight those things, relevant to the major risks in that watershed. And you can relatively quickly get a feel for, Bob's property is a 98% priority, Peter's is a 77%. But then it's important to try to couple those ecological indicators with some social and economic variables as well. So willingness to participate, do they have a history of being part of conservation programs? Are you getting diversity of engagement from different portions of the watershed? Is equity being considered, and those sorts of things? So what we found is really coming to stakeholders with a variety of different approaches that may be appropriate, and then really picking one based on budget and time and level of complexity that is necessary, and really focusing on potentially bringing in partners who have a lot of experience in deploying those types of processes. We've seen that generally be successful and efficient way to go about it. In terms of the monitoring and evaluation, I would argue that that's still very much an in development part of the process. And again, it really needs to tie back to the real drivers of concern and the vision statement that you have for your program. And up front, it'll likely have to be more output oriented, so acres and numbers of practices and miles of stream that have been addressed. But you really want to be focusing early on how you can begin to capture, whether it's stream gauges or other things, actual changes in the services. So nutrient reduction, sediment reduction, flood control benefits, etc.
Excellent, thank you. And Bob, someone was wondering, you'd mentioned the core BMPs that were used in your community. What are the 10 core BMPs, or what are some of them that you guys implemented?
Oh, you could have made me remember things now. There was forest conservation, pasture conservation. Let's see, we had stormwater facility retrofits, rural roads improvements, stream restoration and stream riparian zone preservation. Oh, let's see what the others are. There was the regular agricultural practices for pasture management, including nutrient management, pasture renovation, and the education and outreach, I believe, was the last one.
Wow,
I don't know if I named 10 or not, but
excellent. And we're running out of time here, but I do want to ask just one last question, sort of to whoever wanted to answer. But what advice might you give a local community just getting started if there's mutual interest in setting up this sort of program? Especially, who do you pick as the convener? The utility, the nonprofit, a local government representative? Where should they start?
That has Todd written all over it.
Yeah, and thanks, Peter. I mean, I think in many ways it starts by really understanding what has worked in other places and how much of those lessons you can simply just kind of drag and drop to your watershed, and what you truly need to sort of develop from the ground up that is because of local contextual issues. And my guess is, you know, more than half of the stuff you can really just use as a plug and play, and think of it as a Mad Libs and sort of fill in the dots. That, we think, can save you from 18-month startup time to 6-month startup time. So building on others is one of the most important things. Most often, you see NGOs as sort of the catalyst behind this, but as early as possible, finding support within the utility sector, within local government, finding a corporate partner as well is also a really great way to move this from theory to practice.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Go ahead.
Just a quick thought, Todd and Bob, I don't want to speak for you, but are you guys willing to entertain calls from folks who are interested in starting a program and need a little coaching? I certainly am. And
sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Excellent idea. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for participating in this panel, and thank you to the audience for sticking around. I hope that we are able to teach you guys a little bit about taking advantage of potential watershed protection opportunities, how to secure some funding, and establishing and growing a successful program. Just a reminder, all of this entire webinar will be posted on the website, and so please check that out. And also make sure that you check out our future webinars. I think our next one is coming up on November 10th. So without any further questions, I think that is it. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.